Order. Before I call the Chancellor of the Exchequer, it may be for the convenience of honourable members if I remind them that at the end of the Chancellor's speech, copies of the budget resolutions will be available to them in the vote office. Mr. Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, this budget takes place as the UK economy is emerging from the deepest global recession for over 60 years. It has been a testing time which has required governments across the world to make difficult decisions, difficult choices, and take unprecedented actions. We had to decide whether to intervene to rescue the financial system or to stand on the sidelines, whether we should support the economy, business and families, or let the recession take its course. The record shows the right calls were made. Mr. Deputy Speaker, global recession has not turned into depression. Unemployment here in the UK has not risen as much as was feared. Borrowing, as I will explain later, is lower than forecast last year. But the recovery is still in its infancy, and there are equally tough choices ahead. Choices that will shape our economy and society for decades to come. The task now is to bring down borrowing in a way which does not damage the recovery or the frontline services on which people depend. The challenge now is how we invest as a country to support the industries of the future and allow the talent of the British people to flourish. And at the heart of our decisions is a belief that government should not stand aside, but should instead help people and business achieve their ambitions. My budget today builds on this belief and in our confidence in this country. This will be a budget to secure the recovery, to tackle borrowing, and to invest in our industrial future. It will continue targeted support for businesses and families where and when it is needed. It will set out how we will stick to our plan to halve the deficit within 4 years. Mr. Deputy Speaker, our economy is at a crossroads. Having come through this global recession, this budget will set out a route for the country to long-term prosperity. At its heart is a £2.5 billion one-off growth package to help small businesses promote innovation, invest in national infrastructure and in key skills. This package will be paid for by switching spending from within existing allocations and the extra proceeds from the tax on bank bonuses in line with a budget that is balanced over the period. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the world is still recovering from the severest economic shock of our lifetime. Despite what some try and suggest, the recession has not been restricted to the UK, nor did it begin here. A storm which began in America spread rapidly around the world. It was the biggest test countries had faced in modern times. When I presented my budget a year ago, world leaders had just met in London to agree unprecedented action to rescue the global economy. Governments of all political colours acted to stabilise their banking systems and to use fiscal and monetary policy to boost demand and to protect jobs. Now, not everyone here supported the action taken, but with hindsight, it is even clearer that the right calls were made. Economic disaster was averted, growth has begun to return across the major world economies, and the prospects for the global economy are much more positive than they were a year ago. But, Mr. Deputy Speaker, there is nothing preordained about continued recovery. There are still uncertainties. Financial markets are febrile. Oil prices have increased by over 50%. Bank credit, whilst it's improved, still remains weak in many parts of the world, and confidence has not fully returned to either businesses or consumers. And this is particularly the case in Europe, which is the market for 60% of our exports. Germany saw no growth in the last quarter. Ireland, another key trading partner, has contracted by over 10%. Spain is still in recession. Italy has slid back into negative growth. Unemployment at 10% across the euro area is adding to uncertainty. And all these factors are having an impact, particularly on an open trading economy like the UK. So it's imperative that EU countries act with renewed energy and vigour to get the European economy moving forward again. We need to support trade, discourage protectionism and take forward structural reforms. And such continued international action is crucial not only to global prospects but to each and every country's future. Now, over the last 2 years, we have been reminded of the force for good that governments can be in protecting people. The role of government is now equally critical in regulating the global financial system and putting in the right foundations for future growth, jobs and prosperity. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the crisis in the world economy started in the banking sector, so improved global financial regulation must be the key priority. Our first tests here in the UK came with the problems of Northern Rock. The government intervened to protect savers and to underpin the financial system. The unprecedented decision to nationalise a high street bank was controversial, as was our action later that year to recapitalise the banking system. And other governments right across the globe also acted to stabilise the financial system. And I believe this judgment has proved correct. In the United Kingdom, the latest figures from Northern Rock show it is returning steadily to normality. RBS is now being restructured and is rebuilding. Last week, Lloyds predicted a return to profitability this year. We will sell our shares in RBS and Lloyds, as well as Northern Rock, in a way that maximises value to the taxpayer and recoups the money we have invested. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we intend to get all taxpayers' money back. In the meantime, I can tell the House that the Treasury has already received over £8 billion in fees and charges from the banks in return for our support. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, at the pre-budget report, I put in place a one-off 50% tax on the excessive bonuses of bankers. I made it clear that banks had a choice of whether to pay bonuses or not. But if they did, given the amount of taxpayer support that had been provided, I believed it was right that the country as a whole should benefit. I can tell the House that this tax has raised £2 billion, more than twice as much as was forecast. This is money paid by the banks. Those receiving bonuses will also, of course, have to pay the income tax at their highest rate. Mr. Deputy Speaker, as well as supporting the banking system during the crisis, we need long-term reform to prevent excessive risk-taking. Under our presidency of the G20 last year, we put in place a plan to reform the international regulatory system. But we still need to do more to strengthen global banking. The G20 countries must put in place new rules on capital and liquidity by the end of the year. And we also need to reform remuneration practices to improve cross-border resolution for when banks fail and ensure international standards are implemented. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we cannot continue with a situation where the banks are rewarded for creating excessive risk, but the taxpayer foots the bill when things go badly. More countries now agree on the need for an international systemic tax on the banks. And this must be brought forward quickly, as I will urge the international finance ministers in Washington when they meet next month. And I agree with all those who think such a tax should be internationally coordinated. Going it alone, as some have suggested, would cost thousands of jobs, not just in London, but across the whole country. Global efforts must be complemented in each country with a drive to implement existing banking reforms, as we are in the UK. As part of the reform of banking, I want to make it easier for everyone to access banking services. Since 2003, the number of people without a bank account has been halved, and I can announce today that we will do more to combat financial exclusion through a guarantee that everyone can have a basic bank account. And that will mean, over the next 5 years, up to 1 million more people will have access to bank accounts, something essential in the modern world. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we must be careful that as banks begin to return to profit, the sense of urgency around reform is not diminished. There could be no return to business as usual for the banks. But we must also remember that their success is vital not just for the global economy, but also for Britain's future. London is the world's leading financial centre. Across the country, the sector supports over 1 million jobs, including in Edinburgh, Leeds, Manchester, Cardiff and in other cities. A healthy, strong financial services industry is essential for our long-term prosperity. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the crisis might have started in the financial sector, but it spread rapidly to the entire global economy, underlining why intervention was essential. The impact has meant that the UK economy has contracted by around 6% over the course of the recession, and this compares to 8% in Japan, 7% in Germany and 4% in the United States. Businesses in the UK have taken painful decisions. Many families have seen their incomes squeezed. And given the intensity of the global storm, no government, of course, could prevent all jobs being lost or all businesses from closing. But I believe that governments have the ability to act, and I believe the responsibility to reduce the length and severity of the recession, which is why we took decisive action to stimulate the economy, cutting taxes for families and business, as well as bringing forward capital spending. We also introduced initiatives such as the car scrappage scheme to protect jobs and skills. And I can tell the House that this has helped drive an increase in sales of nearly 30% in the past year, this in the middle of a recession. These decisions, of course, have a cost, but the cost would have been far greater for families and for the economy if we had failed to act. For Mr. Deputy Speaker, we could have followed previous governments and watched from the sidelines. We could have listened to those who opposed all these measures last year. But if we had, I believe that we would still have been in recession. I'm also certain that the pain caused would have been worse and more widely felt. Indeed, in the recession of the 1990s, the rate of home repossessions was twice as high as now. That would have been the cost of abandoning families to their fate. Double the rate of business failures, that would have been the cost of failing to support businesses through this recession. And because of the policy decisions that we made, the Bank of England has been able to take decisive monetary policy action during the downturn. Interest rates have been held at record lows, below 1%, whilst they were at double figures for almost 3 years in the early 1990s. But more than anywhere else, we can see the impact of our choices in the state of the jobs market here. Unemployment has been rising in this country, as it has been around the world. Last week's figures, however, showed that the UK unemployment had fallen and is lower than in the euro area and lower than it is in the United States. Even after the severity of this recession, the claimant count stands today at 1.6 million people. This compares with 3 million people in the recessions of the early 1980s and 1990s. Nor, Mr. Deputy Speaker, because of a decade of welfare reform, has there been the massive increase in the numbers of inactivity benefits that we saw in the 80s and the 1990s. And I can tell the House, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the claimant count today is still lower than the number we inherited in 1997. That has not happened by chance. It has happened because of the choices that we made. It is because of the tremendous efforts by business and workforces to keep people in jobs. It's also because, as the global storm hit our country, we responded with an additional £5 billion to help people find new work quicker. We expanded the Job Centre Plus network and offered support through the Rapid Response Service at firms hit by redundancies. Mr. Deputy Speaker, it is clear that our approach is making a difference. Nearly 4 million people have been helped off the claimant count in the last year alone. With personalised support, around 3/4 of those losing a job are leaving the claimant count within 6 months. Indeed, if this recession had followed the course of the last one, 4 times as many jobs would have disappeared. The flexibility of the tax credit system has also provided automatic support, compensating families for loss of income due to shorter working hours and part-time working. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I can tell the House this year 440,000 families have benefited from this extra help, on average by £38 more per week when they need it most. Despite all this support, there are groups that are likely to need more help even as the economy recovers. For older workers, I want to extend the support provided by tax credits. To make it easier for those over 60 to receive working tax credit, we will reduce the minimum number of hours they need to work to be eligible. And to enable people who want to work longer, we are now consulting on reform of employers' right to make people retire at 65. We're looking at options which include scrapping the default retirement age, raising it or giving employees stronger rights. For younger workers, I've introduced a guarantee of a job or training for every 18 to 24-year-old after 6 months out of work, which is already proving a success. This was to run until March next year. But with recovery still in its infancy, we should not withdraw this support too soon. And because unemployment has been lower than forecast, the cost has been lower than expected. I've therefore decided to use the money saved to extend the guaranteed offer to young people until March 2012. So for the next 2 years, I can guarantee that no one under 24 will need to be unemployed for longer than 6 months before being offered work or training. Help with jobs now, and as I will outline later, help with jobs for the future. Mr. Deputy Speaker, low mortgage rates have reduced costs for homeowners, but many families still face fears over repossession. The support for mortgage interest scheme, which I enhanced during the recession, is already helping 220,000 homeowners who lost their jobs. To maintain this help during the recovery, I will continue to pay this support at the higher rate for another 6 months. I'm also determined to do more to help families take that first crucial step on the housing ladder. We have introduced new help through shared equity schemes, and in 2008 we also brought in a stamp duty holiday on all transactions under £175,000, which ended in December. By helping 260,000 home buyers, it supported the entire housing market when it needed it most. The housing market is now stabilised and has begun a slow recovery. But many first-time buyers, particularly those without large deposits, still find it hard to get a mortgage. And I want to help them, but to do so in a way that is properly funded. I can announce that I will double the stamp duty limit for first-time buyers from midnight tonight, from 125,000 to 250,000 for this year and next. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this means that 9 in 10 first-time buyers will pay no stamp duty at all. But to ensure this measure does not become a burden on the public finances, this relief will be funded through an increase in the stamp duty to 5% for residential property over £1 million. Mr. Deputy Speaker, tax-free ISAs have been an extraordinarily popular way to save, including for those saving for a deposit on their first home. Since their introduction in 1999, 19 million people have taken them out, saving over £270 billion. From next month, the annual ISA limit will rise from £7,200 to £10,200, of which half can be saved in cash. And to help encourage saving further, I've decided that ISA limits will increase annually in line with inflation. Now, these changes come at a time when the savings ratio has already risen strongly over the past year to the highest it's been since 1998. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the last year has been tough for many people, but the evidence shows it would have been harder still without the choices we made and the action we took to support the economy. We need the same good judgment and decisive action to secure and strengthen the economy and to provide the right basis for the country to seize the opportunities ahead. I want now to turn to my forecasts. As I've said on many occasions, the world economy is still in a period of great uncertainty. In the absence of government action to support the economy, The weakness in some of our overseas markets, particularly Europe, could result in a substantial downward revision of our growth prospects. But because of the action we have taken through the recession and the measures that I am announcing today, I believe that only a small reduction is needed. This year, as I said in last year's budget and last year's pre-budget report, I expect the economy to grow between 1 and 1.5%. I've decided to revise slightly downwards my forecast for 2011 to bring it into line with those of the Bank of England to growth between 3 and 3.5%. And projections for the public finances are based as normal on the lower end of these forecast ranges. And as the economy continues to rebalance following the recession, my forecast for the following years is unchanged. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we've already seen inflation rise above 3% in the first month of this year, increasing the cost of living. The inflation figures released yesterday show a rise of 3%. And although high compared to recent years, this is a far lower sum than the peaks of inflation of over 10% in the 1990s and 20% in the 1980s. And as the Governor of the Bank of England has said, the present increase in inflation should be temporary and results from the ending of the VAT cut and other one-off factors. I want, however, to help families and business through this period. So I've decided to stage next month's increase in fuel duties. Instead of the planned increase, fuel duty will rise by a penny in April, which is less than inflation, and it will be followed by a further 1 penny rise in October and the remainder in January. And the staging will ease the pressure on businesses and family incomes at a time when other prices are increasing. Mr. Deputy Speaker, by the time the full rise comes in at the beginning of next year, I am forecasting inflation will be back at 2%. And I am today writing to the Governor of the Bank of England in the usual way to confirm that inflation target remains unchanged at 2%. So with interest rates also expected to remain low and stable, this is essential for future growth. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the cost of stabilising the financial system and stimulating economies has meant an inevitable increase in government borrowing here and around the world. This has been exacerbated by the sharp fall in tax revenues during the recession. The importance of our financial industry, which provided 1 in every £4 in corporation tax, has meant that we have been particularly badly hit. At the pre-budget report, I forecast that public sector net borrowing would reach £178 billion this year. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we now have hard data rather than forecasts on tax revenues for 11 months of this financial year. And as a direct result of the action we took supporting the economy at a difficult time, tax receipts in December, January and February have been better than expected. More resilient consumers and retailers have meant that VAT receipts are now £3 billion higher. Better company profits have led to higher corporation tax receipts. With more people having stayed in work, income tax revenues are stronger. These are the results of the deliberate choices we've made over the last 2 years. And at the same time, spending, including on benefits and tax credits, has been broadly in line with our forecast. As a result, I can tell the House that borrowing this year should now be £11 billion lower at £167 billion. In 2010-11, in part because of the one-off factors boosting receipts, such as this year's tax on bank bonuses, borrowing will be £163 billion. Now, it would not be sensible to assume that this year's surplus in receipts will be maintained in full in the medium term. But with the economy recovering in later years, together with the revenue from tax increases already announced, borrowing will fall to £131 billion in 2011-12, then to £110 billion. In 2013-14 it will be £89 billion. It will reach £74 billion in 2014 and 15. That is £8 billion lower than was forecast in December. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this will mean that debt is £100 billion lower by 2013-14 than was expected in last year's budget. As a share of the economy, borrowing is forecast at 11.8% of GDP this year. It will then fall to 11.1% next year, then 8.5%. In 2012-13 it will be 6.8%, then 5.2% and fall to 4% in 2014 and 15. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this means a reduction in the deficit from 11.8% to 5.2%, more than halved over a 4-year period. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the structural deficit, which takes into account the economic cycle, is estimated to be 8.4% of GDP this year and fall to 2.5% by the end of the period. Mr. Deputy Speaker, that is a reduction in the structural deficit of over 2/3, removing the bulk of the structural deficit by the end of the next Parliament. And as I said before, should the economy perform better than expected, we will be able to do more to reduce the deficit. Mr. Deputy Speaker, in 2007, government debt as a share of the economy was lower in the UK than in every other G7 country except Canada. Debt has increased across the world as a result of this global recession. According to the IMF, net debt as a share of GDP is expected to reach 82% in Germany, 83% in France, and 85% in America. As a result of our action to support the economy, I can forecast that public sector net debt here will reach 54% of GDP this year. It will then increase to 75% by the end of the forecast period in 2014-15. But net debt as a share of GDP will begin to fall the year after that. And even at its peak, debt will be in line with the average of the G7 economies. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this is the fastest deficit reduction plan of any G7 country, and we will meet our statutory obligations. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I know there are some demanding immediate cuts to public spending, and I believe that such a policy would be both wrong and it would be dangerous. To start cutting now risks derailing the recovery, which is already bringing down borrowing more rapidly than was expected. To go faster in the face of uncertainty would mean taking a huge risk with people's jobs, incomes, and our country's future. And I'm not prepared to take that risk. We have worked too hard as a country to come through this recession to throw it away now. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we will need to work as hard to establish a platform for sustained growth, jobs and prosperity in the long term. Since the start of the global crisis, I've always been clear the support for the economy now must go hand in hand with a clear plan to reduce borrowing. And our plans to reduce borrowing by £78 billion in cash terms over the next 4 years. We are set to achieve this goal by a combination of 3 elements: tax, public spending cuts, and, of course, growth in the economy. First, on taxes, I've already made difficult decisions, and I've been guided by our values of fairness and the need not to undermine the recovery. The 1 penny increase in the main rate of national insurance contributions will not affect anyone earning under £20,000 a year, nor will it come into effect until April next year, by which time I expect the recovery will be stronger and more secure. The 50% rate of income tax will come in next month, but it only affects those with earnings over £150,000 a year. That's the top 1% of earners. For people with incomes over £100,000 a year, the top 2%, we will gradually remove the value of their personal allowances. Tax relief on pensions will be restricted from next year, but again only on those with incomes above £130,000 a year. Looking across all the tax rises since the beginning of this global crisis, 60% of them will be paid for by the top 5% of earners. We have not raised these taxes out of dogma or ideology. We're determined to ensure our overall tax regime remains competitive. But I believe, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that those who have benefited the most from the strong growth in incomes in the past years should now pay their fair share of tax. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I have no further announcements on VAT, on income tax or national insurance rates. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I can confirm that duty on beer, wine and spirits will increase as planned from midnight on Sunday. Alcohol duties will also be increased by 2% above inflation for 2 further years from 2013, and the planned increase in fuel duty and landfill tax will continue for 1 year from 2014. There is a long-standing anomaly which has meant that cider has been undertaxed in comparison to other alcoholic drinks. So I intend to correct this So duty on cider will be increased by 10% above inflation from midnight on Sunday. And in September, changes will be made to the definition of cider to ensure specific strong ciders are taxed more appropriately. Tobacco duty will will increase from today by 1% above inflation and then increase by 2% in real cuts each year, real terms each year until 2014. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I have also decided to freeze inheritance tax threshold for a further 4 years, and this will help meet the cost of care for older people. And my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Health, will shortly set out further proposals. Altogether, our tax plans will raise £19 billion towards reducing borrowing. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the next element of our fiscal plan is to control public spending. But to cut spending now, before recovery is self-sustaining, will be short-sighted and counterproductive. That's not just my view, but of governments around the world, the IMF, the World Bank and the OECD. I know others take an opposite view. Indeed, the House will remember, in his budget response last year, the Leader of the Opposition even then demanded immediate action to cut spending. If we had listened to him, the result would have been to deepen the recession and to delay the recovery, to see more businesses closing and more jobs lost. And as a result, borrowing would have been higher, not lower. Now, we didn't follow that course, nor did any other G20 country. And cutting support now would take demand out of the economy, pull the rug from under the recovery, and delay our return to sustained growth. So we will stick to our spending plans for next year, which will see a 2.2% real terms increase. This will allow more time for the private sector to invest and create jobs, ensuring that the recovery will continue and strengthen. It will also mean that we can maintain the improvements we put in place for our frontline services over the last 13 years. Improvements which have seen 118 new hospitals, 1,600 new schools and tens of thousands of extra doctors, nurses, police and teachers. Now, in December, I set out how we will protect public spending on those frontline public services on which we depend. And this enabled us to guarantee NHS health checks every 5 years for the over 40s, referral to a cancer specialist within 2 weeks, extra maths and English tuition for all 7 to 11-year-olds who fall behind, a place in education or training for every 16 and 17-year-old, and maintaining funding for police officer numbers. And I can confirm that we will honour these guarantees. I can also confirm that we will allocate over £4 billion from next year's reserve to fund operations in Afghanistan. I know the whole House will want to join me again in paying tribute to the courage, commitment and professionalism of our armed forces who represent all that is best in our country. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we can only offer these guarantees for frontline services and deliver our plan to reduce the deficit through continued reform and efficiencies and holding down increases in spending overall. If unemployment is lower than predicted, as has already been the case, the cost of paying benefits will be lower. Debt interest costs have also been lower than expected. Even so, it's clear that the next spending settlement from 2011 onwards will be very tough, the toughest for decades. Even before the spending review has been held, we have already identified cuts and efficiencies of over £20 billion through limiting pay, reducing programmes and making savings. Mr. Deputy Speaker, in December I set out savings of £4.4 billion in the public sector pay and pensions by 2012-13. There will be reductions in the pay bill for senior civil servants. Overall, we intend that public pay settlements be held at a maximum of 1% for the 2 years from 2011, and will also implement reforms to ensure public pensions are affordable. But second, we need to identify savings across every part of the public sector by delivering services more efficiently. They will be tough and challenging, but they are achievable. We've already saved £26.5 billion from departmental budgets between 2005 and 2008, but we need to go further. At the pre-budget report, we committed government departments to find over £11 billion in new savings through reforms without damaging the frontline services. And departments will publish today details of how they will make these savings from 2011 as we work towards the spending review. We will also find savings by relocating civil servants from expensive London offices to elsewhere in the country. in the long term, I'm announcing that the number of civil servants in London will be reduced by a third, and as a first step, 15,000 posts will be relocated within the next 5 years. And I can tell the House today that 1,000 posts in the Ministry of Justice will be moved out of central London, saving £41 million. Third, on top of these savings, we have already identified £5 billion worth of cuts in specific programmes announced in December, and I can confirm that these will go ahead as planned. Fourth, it's always been our goal to reform the benefit system so that it makes work pay. The current approach to calculating housing benefit pays very high rates to a small number of tenants in expensive areas, and this discourages employment and it's unfair. So I can tell the House that we are taking steps to address this, so from October next year the most expensive properties across the country will be excluded from the housing benefit calculation in each area. And this, in addition to measures to prevent fraud and error, will save nearly £250 million a year by the end of the forecast period. Mr Deputy Speaker, that's over £11 billion from greater efficiencies, £5 billion from scaling back or cutting lower priorities, and over £4 billion from reducing the cost of public sector pay and pensions. In total, £20 billion worth of savings to reduce borrowing, protect frontline services even before the spending review. And there's one other area which can help reduce government debt. I announced at last year's budget a programme to secure £16 billion through asset sales, and we're making considerable progress. On the student loan book, we're looking to appoint advisers in the next couple of months to develop a sales proposal. On the tote, we're on track to launch the sales process this summer, and we're also finalising options on the sale of the Dartford crossing. And these proceeds from these sales will make a significant contribution to reducing debt. Mr Deputy Speaker, the third element of our plan to reduce borrowing is economic growth. As we've already seen in the enhanced tax receipts since December, a stronger economy can make a major contribution to reducing borrowing. The raw materials to fuel this growth are here in abundance. No country has more talent. We remain the world's sixth biggest manufacturing nation. We have world-class industries, advanced manufacturing, bioscience, aerospace, the creative sector, whose products are in demand across the globe. We've worked hard to create the environment where this ingenuity and entrepreneurial flair can thrive. Doubling investment in our science base, low interest rates and inflation, the lowest rate of corporation tax in the G7. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, our competitors are not standing still. The opportunities and jobs of the future will come from the new markets and new locations, particularly in the East. We can't take growth for granted, and again we have a choice. We can sit back and hope for the best, or we can recognise the role government can play in providing a launchpad for businesses to succeed. Of course, it is the private sector, with its drive and ingenuity, which will create jobs and prosperity. But just as government has been critical in reducing the severity of the recession, government also has a crucial role in building our country's strengths. Together with the Business Secretary, I've been working to find effective ways to enable small business to grow, to invest in key national infrastructure and skills, as well as to promote research, innovation and enterprise. Mr Deputy Speaker, access to finance is vital for small businesses. It was understandable that banks reduced lending to repair their balance sheets, but it caused problems for companies and the wider economy. In return for support during the financial crisis, we've made banks accept their obligations to lend more. In the last 12 months, RBS and Lloyds, which make up half the market, have lent £38 billion to small and medium-sized businesses. But as recovery gets underway, we need to ensure that viable SMEs continue to get the credit that they need. So over the next year, I've agreed that RBS and Lloyds will provide a total of £94 billion of new business loans, nearly half of it going to SMEs. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, there are still companies who are being unfairly denied credit and feel they are powerless to challenge that decision. I want to change this position and give them the right to have their credit complaints properly examined. To help them and the economy, I will set up a new service to fast-track credit complaints from SMEs. This new credit adjudication service will examine lending decisions to see if they are fair. It will have legal powers to enforce its judgments if they believe credit has been wrongly denied. But ultimately, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the best way to open up credit for business is to boost competition. We've already made sure that the restructuring of Lloyds and RBS, which will see 900 branches change hands, will bring new entrants into the market. At least 5 new banks have already either established themselves as business lenders or are in the final stages of setting up. We want even more competition, so the Financial Services Authority will improve and speed up the licensing processes for new banks. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we want successful businesses to be able to attract equity and venture capital as well as bank loans. The government already offers a wide range of support for businesses to help unlock additional private investment. But businesses find the wide variety of options daunting. So we're bringing together all these initiatives under a new National Investment Corporation to be called UK Finance for Growth, which will streamline and improve our offer to the SME sector. The new body will oversee the government's £4 billion range of finance support for businesses. This will also include a new growth capital fund, which will have a specific role in providing fast-growing companies the private capital that they need. Commercial banks have so far agreed to contribute over half the £200 million committed to this fund, and it will eventually provide £500 million of finance. In addition, in this budget, I'm taking forward a range of proposals to help larger firms to access non-bank sources of lending. Small businesses throughout the country count central government as one of their key clients, and building on the recommendations of the Glover Review, I will increase by 15% the proportion of central government contracts that go to small and medium-sized firms. This could mean new businesses worth an extra £3 billion from central government alone and up to £15 billion across the wider public sector. In addition, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we're taking steps to speed up payments to businesses from government departments so that 80% of invoices will be paid within 5 days. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I will also provide extra support to small businesses through the tax system. The improved time to pay scheme has helped businesses spread £5 billion worth of tax payments over a timetable they can afford. Between them, these businesses employ over 1.4 million people, and the extra time has also helped businesses pay more of the tax they owe. This double benefit has convinced me the scheme should be extended for the whole of the next Parliament. On top of giving small businesses more time to pay taxes, I want to reduce their taxes and to help them invest and expand. First, business rates are a fixed cost from the moment a company moves into their premises. The Federation of Small Businesses say this is the 3rd biggest cost after salaries and rents. So to help fledgling businesses set up, as well as existing ones, I've decided to cut business rates for 1 year from October. This means a tax reduction for over 500,000 small businesses in England, 345,000 of which will pay no business rates at all. That includes 90,000 industrial premises, 60,000 offices and almost 100,000 shops. Second, I'm determined to make sure the tax system does not hold back decisions to invest during the economic recovery. Scrapping investment allowances, as some have proposed, in order to pay for an overall rate of corporation tax makes no sense at all. It would mean, for example, that manufacturers and many smaller companies would see their tax bills increase, whereas banks would get a windfall profit. So instead, I want to help small businesses expand by doubling the annual investment allowance to £100,000. As a result, 99% of businesses will be able to deduct in the first year from their taxable profits all investments in plant and machinery. Third, I'm also going to make it more attractive for wealth creators and innovators to set up their own businesses, and to do that, I'm doubling the entrepreneurs' relief for capital gains tax. At the moment, the first £1 million of lifetime gains are taxed at a lower rate of 10% rather than the main rate of 18%. And this threshold will now increase to £2 million, enabling entrepreneurs to benefit more from their effort and their investment. And I can also confirm today that I'm not increasing the main rate of capital gains tax. Mr. Deputy Speaker, better access to finance, improved procurement, lower taxes and more time to pay. This is benefiting hundreds of thousands of small businesses, providing the backbone of future economic growth and jobs. Mr. Deputy Speaker, investment in both traditional and new infrastructure is also vital if our economy is to grow and our businesses are to succeed. We have to move goods and people around the country and around the globe. It's no good supporting high-speed rail links in principle, but declining to back plans which might lead to local controversy. The government is taking forward plans for a high-speed rail link from London to the Midlands and then to the north and Scotland. In government, we have taken the tough decisions to improve our transport links and to cut delays in our planning system. Plans for Crossrail, Heathrow, along with high-speed trains, will improve transport in this country and support some 100,000 jobs over the coming years. Roads, of course, are an essential part of our transport network. The bad weather over the last few months has taken a damaging toll on their condition, so I'm providing £100 million to pay for repairs to local roads throughout the country and £285 million to pay for improvements in the motorway network, including by expanding capacity by allowing hard shoulder running. For this and other measures, there will be consequential provisions where appropriate for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Mr. Deputy Speaker, improving infrastructure also requires us to renew and modernise our energy supplies. Again, our competitors are not standing still. China is building a new power station every week to meet its growing energy needs. We need to take long-term decisions to secure our supplies while moving to a low-carbon economy. And that means replacing our ageing nuclear power stations. It means investing in renewable energy along with sustainable transport. In last year's pre-budget report, I set up the Infrastructure UK to advise on how our country can achieve these goals. And today they publish a new strategy setting out a route map and the investment that will be needed. To deliver this ambition, vital for future jobs and the health of our planet, I'm setting up an investment bank. It will control £2 billion worth of equity. Half will come from the assets, including the Channel Tunnel rail link, and the rest matched by private investment. And this equity will unlock billions more of finance from the private sector. The fund will focus first on investing in green transport and sustainable energy, in particular offshore wind power, where Britain is already the world leader. And to strengthen this position further, we're offering £60 million to develop ports to host manufacturers of offshore wind turbines. And this will help the UK secure new inward investment deals and support thousands of extra jobs in these sectors. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the UK has the potential to be the world leader in digital economy, and realising this ambition would create thousands of new businesses and hundreds of thousands of new jobs. It will also open the way for public services to be delivered more effectively and at lower cost. And access to the high-speed broadband is essential to deliver these goals. Now, we've taken the decision to ensure the benefits are spread to rural as well as urban areas and are not limited to the better off. The 50p monthly landline duty will unlock private investment and enable 90% of the country to access the next generation of fast broadband by 2017. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I now turn to how we will give targeted help to British industry to realise its global potential. The role of modern government is to work with key sectors to help them compete and prosper. We will not go back to the interventionism of the past, but nor can we return to the hands-off approach of the free marketeers. It's also through partnership, not indifference, that Britain can and will succeed. It's a source of pride that 50% of all Ford diesel engines in the world are now produced in Britain's cutting-edge engineering plants. It's testament to the commitment of their staff and the high quality of their research and development. But the government has also played a part with financial support in this success story. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the government again cannot develop and manufacture electric cars, but we can provide the support to help these projects take place in Britain. The announcement by Nissan last week that it's to produce in Sunderland the first mass-produced electric car was a vote of confidence in British engineering and its workforce. But this groundbreaking venture would not have happened without our support to unlock this private investment. And it's precisely this cooperative approach which will ensure our country competes successfully on a global scale. The same partnership has been built in the life sciences sector, which already employs over 120,000 people. Our approach can be seen in the patent box, for example, which offers tax breaks on incomes from patents held in the UK. This will lead to more products being manufactured here in this country. Our creative industries are also a huge source of jobs, wealth and pride. And I will offer help to the computer game sector, similar to the steps which are helping restore the fortunes of the British film industry. This is a highly successful, growing industry with half its sales coming from exports, and we need to keep British talent in this country. From advanced manufacturing to pharmaceuticals, from digital communications to creative arts, it is the ideas that are driving their success. So, building on the Hauser Review, we will ensure that the UK's technology and innovation centres achieve their potential to commercialise new British discoveries. We've also strengthened the links between universities and business to ensure ideas are harnessed for commercial success. But we need to do more. We will set up a £35 million University Enterprise Capital Fund to provide direct support for university innovation and spin-out companies. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, along with the impact of new ideas, it will be the ambition of young people that will carry this country's success. We need to invest in skills, in education and in our centres of learning. Over the last 13 years, we've increased the number of places and funding for universities by 25%. Almost 400,000 more of our talented young people now go on to university than did in 1997. Given this unprecedented rise in investment and the need to tighten public spending overall, universities must make efficiency savings while focusing their funds rigorously on quality teaching and on research. And we're determined to achieve this without damaging key skills and our economic strengths. To help them do this, we're going to provide an extra one-off funding of £270 million in 2010-11 through a modernisation fund, which will help universities create 20,000 more university places, largely in key subjects like science, technology, engineering and maths, starting in September of this year. Mr Deputy Speaker, these extra places allow us to strengthen our offer for young people and ease parents' concern that their first child's taste of life after school or college will be a prolonged spell on the dole queue. We have seen in past recessions what a potential waste this was and the long-term damage that it caused. Because of the choices we've made, every school and college and university leaver, as well as every recent graduate under the age of 24, will receive personal help and new opportunities. And that will be delivered by a guaranteed place in education or training for all 16 and 17-year-olds, a guaranteed job, work experience or training for every 18 to 24-year-old, supporting a higher number of apprenticeships and now more university places for those who want them. And the cost of this £2.5 billion one-off growth package to invest in Britain's future will be met partly by switching resources from existing budgets and, as I said, by the higher revenues than the tax on bankers' bonuses. And I expect, Mr Deputy Speaker, that the cost of this will be repaid many times over in the coming years with new jobs, new opportunities and greater prosperity. Mr Deputy Speaker, this recession has had an impact on people across the world. It's often the most vulnerable who are affected most, those in insecure jobs or on modest incomes. Whilst people are suffering hardship, it is all the more unfair that some are escaping their tax obligations. Mr Deputy Speaker, I am determined to continue our successful drive to prevent avoidance and evasion. Measures in this budget will bring in additional tax worth £500 million each year, whilst protecting £4 billion worth of revenues by 2012 and 13. These steps include tax agreements like that already signed with Liechtenstein, which is expected to bring in around £1 billion of extra revenue. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, I can also now tell the House that we are ready to sign tax information exchange agreements with 3 additional countries. Which are, Mr Deputy Speaker, Dominica, Grenada and Belize. I have a further announcement to make, and that is this. We expect these deals to be signed within a few days, which is rather quicker than the 10 years it's taken the front bench opposite to exchange information with the deputy chairman of their party. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we are proud of our achievements in helping families and tackling child poverty. For the newborn, there is an additional element of the child tax credit, as well as the Child Trust Fund, something which I know will even be better news to certain members of the House. Preschool children are benefiting from a massive expansion in free childcare places, and I want to do more to help the parents of 1- and 2-year-olds by increasing by £4 a week the money paid to the child tax credit from 2012. And that extra money will be paid for all children who need it, whether their parents are married, living together or living apart. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we also have tackled pensioner poverty. In 1997, hundreds of thousands of pensioners lived on a basic state pension worth about £62 a week. From next month, because of the above-inflation increases in the basic state pension and the introduction of the pension credit, every pensioner will be entitled to a weekly income of £132.60. We've announced increased personal allowances for older pensioners, which will mean that from April next year, no one over 75 will pay any tax on the first £10,000 of their income. Now, the cold weather conditions of the last few months have underlined the importance of the winter fuel payment for many pensioners. Mr. Deputy Speaker, over the last 2 years, these payments were temporarily increased to £250 and £400 for the over 80s. Without action today, the winter fuel payment would have decreased in value this coming winter, but I've decided this would be unfair, so I'll guarantee this higher winter fuel payment for another year. It means 9 million pensioner households will receive at least £250 this winter to help with their fuel bills. And in line with our values and fairness, help for pensioners, families and homeowners over the coming year, it's paid for by closing down tax loopholes that I've already announced. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I believe the government has made the right choices to rebuild our public services. When faced with the upheaval of the global recession, we made the right choices to support the economy, businesses and families. Because of the steps we took, opposed by the party opposite, the recovery has begun, unemployment is falling and borrowing is better than expected. The choice before the country now is whether to support those whose policies would suffocate our recovery and put our future at future, or to support a government that has been right about the recession, right about the recovery, has been right about supporting people and businesses in this country and build a prosperous future, and I commend this budget to the House.
Order. Understanding Order number 51. The first motion, entitled Provisional Collection of Taxes, must be decided without debate. Will the Chancellor of the Exchequer please move formally? The question is that, pursuant to Section 5 of the Provisional Collection of Taxes Act 1968, provisional statutory effect shall be given to the following motions. A. Stamp duty land tax, relief for first-time buyers, motion number 5. B. Alcoholic liquor duties rates, motion number 8. C. Tobacco products duty rates, motion number 9. D. Amusement machine licence duty rates, motion number 17. E. Insurance premium tax, separate contracts, motion number 42. F. Stamp duty land tax partnerships, motion number 45. Suppose that people say aye. Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. I now call upon the Chancellor of the Exchequer to move the motion entitled Amendment of the Law, and it is on that motion that the debate will take place today and on the succeeding days. The remaining motions will be put at the end of the budget debate on Tuesday, 30th March. Will the Chancellor please move the Amendment of the Law motion? The question is that it is expedient to amend the law with respect to the national debt and the public revenue, and to make further provision in connection with finance. This resolution does not extend to the making of any amendment with respect to value-added tax so as to provide A, for zero rating or exempting a supply acquisition or importation, B, for refunding an amount of tax, C, for any relief other than a relief that 1, so far as it is applicable to goods, applies to goods of every description, and 2, so far as it is applicable to services, applies to services of every description. Mr. David Cameron.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, so there we have it. Labour's big idea is a stamp duty cut on homes worth less than £250,000. Where on earth did they get that one from? That has been Tory policy for 3 years. He came in as Chancellor, copying our inheritance tax cut. He leaves as Chancellor, copying our stamp duty cut. The only new ideas in British politics are coming on this side of the House. And the only thing that Labour are bringing are debt, waste and taxes. And here is a first. The centrepiece of this budget, the stamp duty cut, has already been torpedoed by a Treasury Minister. This is what the Economic Secretary said about this policy. Raising stamp duty threshold to £250,000 would not be an effective use of public money. First they denounce it, then they embrace this, and that's not all. We just heard, remember our tax plans for super-strength cider? The Chancellor's spokesman, when we announced it, said that that was illegal. It's now official government policy. Remember our proposal for 10,000 extra university places? The Higher Education Minister, the Honourable Member for Tottenham, I know that he's in his place today, or is he he's over there, right? This is what he said. It is clear, as has been demonstrated in the House today, that this fatuous proposal of extra places is elitist. That's what they said about it. Once again, they've been caught taking the public for fools. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Chancellor spoke for an hour. He could have done it all in a sentence. Labour have made a complete mess of the British economy, and they're doing nothing to clean it up. And I have to say, one figure in the Red Book stands out above all others. They have doubled the national debt, and on these figures, they are going to double the national debt again. In this election, in this year, an election year, they are borrowing £167 billion. Now, we are meant to be impressed that it's turned out a few billion lower than the last disastrous forecast, but it is still, and honourable members should be ashamed of this, more than every single Labour government in history has ever borrowed added up together. That's what they've done. Like every Labour government before them, they've run out of money, and they are leaving it to the next Conservative government to clean up the mess. Today, this Chancellor had his last chance to do the right thing for the country. He totally failed. They're going, the taxes for hire are on their way out of the chamber. They're just going to carry on spending, carry on borrowing and carry on failing. And I have to say the biggest risk to our recovery is 5 more years of this Prime Minister. 5 more years of falling confidence, 5 more years of bloat and debt and taxes, 5 more years of Britain closed for business. Most of the Cabinet, looking at their Blackberries, they can't think of a single reason why the country should have another 5 years of this Prime Minister. So I say let's have an election and put them out of their misery. Let's have a look in detail at the appalling mess that the Prime Minister and Voldemort seem to find so funny. Here are some of the things they didn't tell us in the budget. They boasted about trade. Get him an espresso or there'll be trouble. They boasted about trade. They didn't tell us that on page 171 of the Red Book, just published, it says the trade deficit has actually risen by £7 billion. They told us about investment. They didn't tell us that page 169 of the Red Book, it says business investment is actually falling by 5% this year. Mr. Deputy Speaker, almost everything they've told us about the economy has turned out not to be true. They told us they would be prudent. They told us they'd be prudent. This Chancellor has just said that they will be borrowing £734 billion over the next 6 years, giving us a national debt of £1.3 trillion. They have confirmed in the Red Book that the deficit this year, at 11.8% of GDP, is the worst in the OECD except for Ireland. That's what this Labour government has left us with. They talked about education and the importance of education. Next year, they're going to be spending more on debt interest than they are going to be on educating our children. They told us endlessly they had abolished boom and bust, but the figures show they have given us the deepest recession since the war. The figures show we lost 6.2% of our GDP in total. The Chancellor endlessly boasted about the action they'd taken, the longest and deepest recession since the war. Yes, I'll say it again because you should be ashamed of it. Also, endlessly talking about their brilliant judgments, yet we were the first into recession and the last out of recession. Endlessly talking about the great judgments, about how well prepared we were. We went in with the biggest budget deficit and we come out with the largest budget deficit. And of course they promised us real help now. Yet more businesses went bust in this recession than any other, and more people have gone bankrupt under Labour than ever before in our history. And what about all those schemes, so many of the schemes he mentioned, that were launched with great fanfare? How many people did they help? Well, let's take the mortgage support scheme. That was announced in December 2008. They said this was real help for homeowners. So how many homeowners did it help? 15. That cost £66,000 per household helped. Or to put it in a currency the Cabinet can understand, that's about 13 days of Jeff Hoon's consultancy fees. And they told us endlessly about how brilliantly they'd done on unemployment. What a triumph it was on unemployment. 1 in 4 adults of working age in our country are not in work. They talked about the European comparisons. We've got more young people unemployed than anywhere else in Europe. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to be fair to this Prime Minister, there is one forecast he got absolutely spot on. It's when he told that audience of bankers, what you, as the City of London, have done for financial services, we as a government intend to do for the economy as a whole. That is a pledge he met in full. And, Mr. Deputy Speaker, 13 years on from 1997, we can now see what's happened. In 1997, debt was £350 billion. Now it's getting on for £860 billion. In 1997, the deficit was £6 billion. That's what you inherited, a £6 billion deficit. Today, it's £167 billion. In 1997, we were ranked 7th in the world for competitiveness. Now we're 13th. We were 4th in the world for tax and regulation. You want to know what we're going to do? We're going to get back to 4th in the world for tax and regulation. Because I'm glad to see the Honourable Brent North, he slept through the Chancellor's statement and he's woken up for my reply. Do you know where we are today? We are from being 4th in the world for tax and regulation, we are now 84th and 86th. We have gone from the top of the Premier League to the bottom of the conference in 13 wasted years. And we say it is time to sack the manager. No wonder Match of the Day didn't want him, Mr. Deputy Speaker. So that's the mess. What about their plans to clear it up? Pitiful. The big argument in British politics today is this. They say don't do anything before the election. Let's just sit tight and keep our fingers crossed. We say we need real action to get our economy moving, and urgently we need a credible plan to deal with Britain's record debts starting now, and we need to show the world we are back open for business. Now let us start with the debts. This Chancellor repeated his hope to halve the deficit by 2014. Let's be clear about what this means. It means that in 4 years' time, we will have a deficit almost as big as when Dennis Healey went to the IMF in the 1970s. We are not the only ones who think this is completely inadequate. The CBI has said current plans to halve the deficit over 4 years are too little, too late. The OECD has said more ambitious fiscal plans would strengthen the recovery, and the European Commission says the government's plans are not sufficiently ambitious. Now, the Prime Minister used to bang on about how we needed a global early warning system. Do we all remember that one? Well, how many more warnings does he need? The lights are flashing, the alarm bells are ringing, but he is ignoring them and doing nothing for this country. A credible plan also requires action now, and all we got was delay. The risk to recovery is not in dealing with the deficit now, it's in not dealing with the deficit now. The Prime Minister and the Chancellor are having a good chat. They're probably discussing what sort of charging fees they can give after the next election. They should listen. Every family knows that when your debts mount up, you need to start paying them off or things only get worse. And it is time for the government to learn the same lessons. The Prime Minister and Chancellor... Sit down. Don't give way. The Prime Minister and the Chancellor faced a choice between bold action in an election year and just playing politics, and once again they chose politics. This Prime Minister will never get a medal for courage, although it has to be said most of his cabinet get mentioned in dispatches. A credible plan also requires some honesty, and instead we got double dealing. All those figures they told us about debt, they're all based on their growth forecast. So let's have a look at the growth forecast. Look at their record of predicting growth. In 2008, they said we'd grow by 2%. In fact, the economy grew by 0.5%. In 2009, they predicted decline of 3.5%. In fact, we shrank by 5%. Now they say the economy will grow by 3.25%. The independent experts say 2.1%. And the Chancellor told us, standing there at the dispatch box, that his forecasts were the same as the Bank of England. They're not. The Bank of England is forecasting 3.1% this year and 3% next year, compared with his forecast of 3.5%. You have to say, the former Chancellor, you used to have to go, you used to have to go through the fine print before you found out rubbish in the budget. This time the rubbish came straight from the dispatch box. Having given us the lowest decade for growth since the Second World War, they're now predicting one of the highest. They've given us the biggest bust in British history, and now they are forecasting an almost permanent boom. Why on earth should anyone believe what they say anymore? What we need is a proper independent office of budget responsibility that we will set up to set independent forecasts and to keep the Chancellor honest. We also need to get Britain back open for business, and again this budget completely fails the test. The Chancellor spent half an hour talking about helping business, but the fact is he is raising £19 billion of extra taxes, many of them charged on business. Why? Because they flunked the difficult decisions on spending, and they are raising tax after tax after tax. There's the fuel duty rise, the broadband tax, the new taxes on small businesses. He talked about a cut, but he didn't mention what happens on April the 5th. The revaluation comes in, the end of transitional relief comes in, hitting every small business in the country. And biggest of all, the rise in national insurance, which is a tax on every single job in our country. They want to tax your car, your phone, your business, your jobs. These are the ticking tax bombshells, time to go off after the election, that will destroy our recovery. And instead of more waste, more spending and more taxes, what this budget needed to do is ease the burden on our families and businesses and let enterprise flourish. That's what a Conservative government will bring. Let's freeze the council tax, no tax on jobs for new businesses, lower corporation tax rates and lower small business tax, radical school and welfare reform. That would be real action to get our economy moving. Now, this Prime Minister is going around telling everyone, stick with me, stick with what you know. But that is the whole problem. This country's stuck with him. Our economy's stuck. Business is stuck. Nothing is moving. And there is, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the arrogance of it. Stick with me. Why? Because I doubled the debt. I put up your taxes. I wrecked the economy. I mortgaged your children's future. It's like the captain of the Titanic saying, let me command the lifeboats. It's like Robert Maxwell saying, let me reinvest your pension. It's like Richard Nixon saying, I'm the man to clean up politics. Does the Prime Minister really expect the British public to turn round and say, thank you for nearly bankrupting the economy? Find me the small business owner who would wake up after a Labour victory and say, thank God we got 5 more years of this red tape and taxes. Find me the family who'd think, great, national insurance is going up and we're all going to be better off. Find me the international business that would think, yes, now's the time to invest in Britain. No one has yet thought of a question to which the answer is 5 more years of this Prime Minister. And that's because there isn't one. We need an unleashing of enterprise across this nation. We need a plan to boost employment through welfare and school reform. It is time this country had a radical change of direction. We need a Conservative government to clean up the mess made by this Labour government, to stop another 5 years of debt, of waste, of taxes. Britain doesn't need this Prime Minister and this Chancellor. It needs new energy, new leadership and values to get this country going again. That's the argument we'll take to the country the moment this man runs out of time and calls that election.
That was really weak.
Order. The House should also hear the response of the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Leader of the Liberal Democrat Party. Can I just say to the House, as many honourable members seem unaware, there is a clear convention that the responses to the budget by the Leader of the Opposition and the Leader of the Liberal Democrats are not interrupted. Mr. Nick Clegg.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, this budget has been billed as the preface to the Labour manifesto. Based on what we've seen today, it won't be a manifesto but an obituary. The Prime Minister may have wanted a giveaway budget. What we got was a given-up budget. This is not the preface to a new government, but a footnote to 13 years of failure. After 13 years, the gap between rich and poor has widened. The poorest 20% pay a higher proportion of their income in tax than the richest. So much for fairness under Labour. We've had the most prolonged recession since the 1930s, and the spectacle of state-owned banks doing deals which put British people out of work. We need real change. We needed a budget that gave us honesty on spending and fairness on taxation. We got neither. The spat we've just seen, where the Leader of the Opposition says that cuts should come now, is a phony war about when to make cuts to cover up the fact that they are both the same. Neither has the courage to come up with the details of the cuts we will need in the years ahead to tackle Britain's deficit. Neither is being straight with the British people about the tough times ahead. This budget was a budget in denial about the scale of change needed, about as honest as the CV of the Right Honourable Member for North Tyneside. It's built on growth figures that are unlikely to materialise. It's built on false comfort from a small drop in borrowing that doesn't affect the structural deficit. We're still borrowing £450 million every single day. And above all, it's a budget in denial about the unavoidable cuts and savings ahead. The Chancellor claims to have identified billions of pounds of cuts, but there's only real detail about a tiny fraction of the total. All the rest we've had today is insubstantial waffle about so-called efficiency savings and a tiny saving in the relocation of civil servants to places outside London. On the other side of the chamber, we've had tough talk about the need to be honest on the deficit. They have barely a fig leaf of detail to back up their claims. They say we need more than £40 billion of cuts by the end of the next Parliament, but have published details about just £2 billion. Their demands for honesty come straight from the Karl Rove School of Politics. Make the biggest fuss about the subject where you have the most to hide. Labour is in denial. The Conservatives are talking tough to cover the truth. They offer more of the same. We needed a budget that gave us honesty in spending and fairness in tax. We got neither. Liberal Democrats are putting our cards on the table. We have identified a first instalment of £15 billion of cuts that can be realised by 2012-2013. Saving £500 million a year by ending government contributions to child trust funds, saving £1.3 billion a year by stopping means-tested benefits for the top 20% of tax credit claimants, cancelling ID cards and second-generation biometric passports, saving £2.5 billion over the next Parliament, and making longer-term savings too by saying no to the like-for-like replacement of Trident. Savings which we will need to start implementing once the economy is strong enough to take the strain. The Chancellor could have made some of those choices today. So could he. But what do we hear from both of them? Nothing. Lots of noise and no honesty whatsoever. Mr. Speaker, one of the government's most shocking sleights of hand in recent months is to try to duck blame for the recession. Yes, there were global forces at play, but most of the problems started right here at home. The overdependence on the banking industry, the personal debt bubble encouraged by this government, and the overinflated housing market, which Labour did everything in their power to stoke up. On the stamp duty reforms announced today, of course we welcome any moves to make the system more progressive. But with 1.8 million families still on a waiting list for an affordable home, it is quite astonishing that this budget was completely silent on the urgent need for more affordable homes for all. And he's added to this by a change to housing benefit announced today, which will make life impossible for low-income families in high-price areas like London. Labour should stop trying to kid people about this recession. They got us into it. Only by being honest about how we got into this mess will we ever be able to get out. Let me turn to a few of the details of the budget today. The Chancellor has only slightly modified his wildly over-optimistic growth forecast to 3 to 3.5% for 2011, against a consensus everywhere else from independent forecasters of 2%. He cannot bury his head in the sand over this just to hide the truth about how long it will take to reduce the deficit. The Chancellor spent a good portion of his speech boasting about the £11 billion he claims to have saved on unemployment costs and unexpected higher tax revenues. He's living in a fantasy land. This government still came in £167 billion over budget last year. That's no record to boast of. Someone living off their credit cards, thousands of pounds in debt, is not suddenly flush with cash just because their phone bill comes in slightly cheaper than he predicted. We are not better off. We are just ever so slightly less worse off. Even with unemployment lower than originally forecast, we'll still have more than 2 million people unemployed and 8 million economically inactive. Of course it's sensible at a time of mass unemployment to direct money to help especially young people. I only wish the Chancellor had had the courage to go further and shorten the guarantee for young people from 6 months to 3 months. 1 in 5 young people are still out of work, and waiting around for 6 months before they get any help pushes many of them into a state of real desperation. I welcome, of course, the way he has more or less carbon copied our long-standing proposals for an infrastructure bank and support for green industries to stimulate more job creation. On fuel duty, I note the government's decision to stage future increases, but they're missing the point. There is a fundamental problem with fuel duty in rural areas where using a car is not a luxury but a necessity. The real priority should be to help rural areas, not just a staged reprieve. On one of the most shocking omissions from this budget was the failure to address the systemic failures in our banking system. We bailed out the banks to the tune of £1 trillion, and they are hoarding money that should instead be lent to businesses, killing off sound businesses and people's jobs. The banks are even helping support deals that put British people out of work, like the Kraft takeover of Cadbury. The failure to get the banks lending is the absolute centrepiece of the government's economic mismanagement. The Chancellor today promises new bank lending targets, but why should anyone believe a word he says after what happened last time he made promises like this? RBS and Lloyds were told to increase net lending by £27 billion. Instead, they decreased net lending by £41 billion. Moving to gross rather than net lending targets is a con that will let the banks off the hook again. The government must now recognise that its heavy pressure on the banks to rebuild their capital bases is limiting bank lending and threatening the health of the economy in the longer term. The banks end up hoarding money instead of lending it. The priority for the nationalised banks in particular should be putting money into the real economy, not into their balance sheets. Mr. Speaker, turning to bankers' bonuses, the government raised more than £2 billion, more money than it had expected from its tax. But that is because the banks refused to change their behaviour. It's amazing how much the banks are willing to pay back to get back to business as usual. A decent budget would have set out a plan to make sure that they can never get back to business as usual. We must ensure the high street banks on which families and small businesses depend are never again put at risk by the casino culture of investment banking. As the Governor of the Bank of England has repeatedly recommended, we need to separate high street and investment banking for good. And until this split can be introduced, the banks, all banks, will remain the beneficiaries of a unique, open-ended guarantee against failure from the taxpayer, a guarantee which they should pay for. And that's why last year we proposed a new levy of 10% on the profits of the banks until they can be split up. I'll give the Chancellor credit for at least some consistency. He has always opposed our plan for this, as he has done today. While the Conservatives, they first ruled it out, then they ruled it in, only for their latest proposed bank tax to fall apart in less than 24 hours. Both parties are wrong. Both parties are wrong. Britain is unique in the world in terms of the liabilities of our banking industry relative to the size of our economy. We do not have the luxury of time. We have to protect ourselves against a future collapse. Mr. Speaker, finally on tax. The other gross disappointment in this budget was the failure to make our tax system fair. Under Labour, the bottom 10% pay a staggering 48% of their income in tax, while the richest pay 34%. He took pride in saying today he would make no big announcements on tax. How can he look at a system like that and say, let's have more of the same. Indeed, his comments seem to suggest a freeze in income tax rates, which would, if earnings rise, once again hit the poorest hardest. So much for fairness under Labour. How can he happily accept that it's okay for a banker in the City of London to pay a far lower rate of tax on their capital gains than their cleaner does on their wages? So much for fairness under Labour. Liberal Democrats propose the most radical tax reform in a generation, hardwiring fairness into Britain's taxes once and for all. We will ensure no one pays tax on the first £10,000 they earn, paid for by closing loopholes that unfairly benefit those at the top, a mansion tax and higher taxes on aircraft. That would mean complete freedom from income tax for 3.6 million more low earners and pensioners, and £700 in the pockets of tens of millions more. And crucially, it would be a down payment to the British people, who are about to take the brunt of the biggest fiscal contraction in post-war history. A declaration of intent. Yes, there will be change, but we guarantee it will be fair. Action on tax is the only way to ensure we can take people with us down the difficult road of deficit reduction. Only the Liberal Democrats are prepared to make real changes in tax to help the millions of people who simply need a break. Mr. Deputy Speaker, after 13 years of Labour, Britain is ready for something different. As we stand on the brink of an election campaign where everything is to play for, where the future of the country is at stake, my message is simple. This budget is the old politics, and the old politics is not good enough anymore. It's time for honesty in spending, it's time for fairness in taxes, and the only party that offers both are the Liberal Democrats.
Mr. John McFall.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I welcome this budget, and can I first of all commend the Chancellor for his stewardship over the past year, not just the Times leader this morning, but individuals I've spoken to in the City over the past year have remarked on the Chancellor's stewardship, on